Hi, this is a summary of Patrick Lecture 56, Week 2. Patrick Lecture 56 is Healthy and Unhealthy Motives in Desire. And the second week of the study guide focuses on the distinction between constructive and destructive life forces. The way I approach things like this is I try to divide and conquer. I try to figure out what I'm supposed to focus on and what isn't necessary to focus on. So it appealed to me, this section. The main thing that the guide wanted to communicate, I believe, was that there are both. That life force in and of itself can be constructive, it can be destructive. The life force itself is neutral, it's how you use it, what kind of energies you put into it. Between the two, constructive and destructive, my suggestion is you don't have to worry about the constructive life forces. They're working just fine, leave them alone. So now all you're left with are the destructive life forces. With destructive life forces, the problem with them is they're not in truth. There's something off. There's a false belief, an image, a forcing current, an agenda. There's something not clean about this current, and that's what makes it destructive, this life force. So the idea is to weed out what is clean and what is not clean. Now, to do that, you have to be conscious of your motives, your images, etc. A lot of people this week have expressed a level of terror at the idea that there's something going on in them and they don't know what it is. I like to take a lighthearted approach to this. You've got to be kidding. There's always something going on in you, that your mind, that your ego, that your conscious awareness is not aware is happening. I always give the example of the body. There's so many things going on. It would, if we had to focus on all the things that were going on, if we had to control all the mechanics of the body, we wouldn't have time to live. So there's a lot of unconscious material going on. If it's constructive, if it's not causing a problem, you don't have to worry about it. And if it is truly unconscious, if it is truly buried deep in your unconscious layers of your awareness, you can't worry about it. You can't, because the deepest unconscious is not accessible to us. So what we're really dealing with is a small range here. We're dealing with destructive life forces that we have some spark of consciousness about, some inkling, some clue, some hint that something's not right. That's really what we're talking about here. You're not talking about the whole thing. Now, besides the fact, the idea of being terrorized by the fact that something's going on that you don't know what it is, the other topic that came up quite a few times this week already was what I designate as perfectionism. And that is, then we have to fix everything. We have to make it perfect. We can't have anything left over. I invite you to think in terms of everyday life. If you're cooking, there are spills and the salt's never perfect. There's a grain more or a grain less. The pan may be a little full or a little empty. The plate may have a spot on it. There's so many imperfections with every meal. And because you need to live and move through it, you can't stop everything and demand that everything be dead perfect for a given meal. Now, I know that some artisans do that when they're, especially if they're being paid to produce a meal, or if it's a prize-winning contest. But I'm talking about everyday activities where you're going to have to accept some levels of imperfection in what you're doing, good enough. Now, we all have different levels of that, so that my standard for what I will eat or how much time I will put in or when I will wait until I have the right ingredients My standard may be different than your standard. Higher, lower, better, slower, faster. Another way to think about this is cleaning a room. Everybody's got a different tolerance level. Everybody has a different idea of how much energy they're willing to put into this room to clean it. And when they're just tired and they say good enough. Now, if you want to get silly about it, what is clean anyway? So if you're talking about on a molecular level, there may be debris there, but you can't really see it, and you might need extremely specialized cleaning materials to clean it, and you wouldn't know one way or the other if you'd actually cleaned it or not, because you can't perceive it. Some dirt cannot be immediately perceived. We tend to perceive buildup. We tend to perceive the thing that's laying in the middle of the room, and we trip over it trying to cross the room. Or when there are so many glasses and dishes on a table that there's no room for anything else. Or when things are so crowded that they start falling over and falling off. Same thing applies to spiritual work. I like to think in terms of this is not rocket science. Spiritual work is the grunge, day by day, daily work of becoming the person you want to be. And you have complete control over that process. You can work as hard as you want or as little as you want. The trick here, or the one thing you can't control, is that if you are engaging in destructive life forces, then they will create consequences. Call it consequences, call it karma. You will affect other people, they will respond. There will be a chain reaction of cause and effect by the energies that you put out. Once again, the positives, we don't really want to, we just enjoy it, have a good time. But the negative ones, most of us want to minimize, or at least find out what's going on so that we can address it, and then we don't get such negative feedback. We don't have negative effects when we're in a negative cause pattern. So you've got constructive and destructive life forces. In the destructive, as well as the constructive, you've got conscious and unconscious material. And then you've got that gray area in between that you may not quite be sure about. That's where spiritual work, the hard spiritual work, is done. If you are fully conscious of your destructive life force, the chances are that you're actively working to stop it. You're actively working to find a solution, to find out what's going on, because it's in your best interests not to have a destructive life force running in your life. Tricky part is that gray area, where all you have is an inkling or a hint. And again, people protest, they complain. Well, how do I know? You know because of cause and effect. You know because of feedback. I remember the one time I literally remember permitting myself to yell at an employee. They had done something particularly egregious. They were guilty, and I didn't see a particular reason why I should restrain myself. So I yelled at them. And 2 weeks later, the company was hit with a lawsuit. They'd gone to a lawyer and they had hit us with a lawsuit for harassment, and we had to post a $50,000 bond. To me, that was, even though it was 2 weeks later, that was instant karma. I knew it was wrong. I indulged myself. The person reacted to it and found a way to basically hurt the company back. And all I can say is I was wrong, shouldn't have done it, and pay the bond and move on. Never amounted to anything, but it was like, it was as if I had decided I'm going to speed and I don't care about the consequences. The next thing I know, there's a policeman pulling me over to the side of the road. I've done that also. It's instant karma, cause and effect. Got it. You can't do that without consequences. And since I don't want the consequences, I will enforce not doing the action. that causes the consequences. Now, why am I going on so much about this? I find that people make this work complicated. They make it too many parts, too many pieces. The story just mushroom clouds and explodes. I also find that they try to rationalize, so they're busy defending themselves instead of looking at the information. So when people share about a destructive quality, there's a lot of talking sometimes that goes on, but not a lot of actual exploration. If you do the actual exploration and you look at what was the feedback, how did I see it, then it's a smaller matter. It doesn't expand and go into overwhelm as easily. So it's easier to work with because it's small and contained. I usually do my 4-finger thing for Pathwork Lecture 127, which is 4 stages of spiritual evolution. And I use it a lot because the lecture is easy to grasp in just a few moments. But please go ahead and read the lecture if you'd like. The 4 stages of spiritual evolution. The first is, the guide calls it automatic reflex. It's when you're not conscious of what's going on. You cannot work there. You have to wait until it begins to some degree to come into awareness, which is stage 2. Awareness is described by the guide as the longest stage and the most painful stage, because you're aware, but you don't quite know why, and you can't control the effect. You move from awareness into stage 3 understanding, and back and forth and back and forth. This is like a little loop where you gain awareness, you get some understanding, you gain some more awareness, you get some more understanding. And this goes back and forth until the proverbial penny drops into stage 4, which is knowing. Now, again, it's easy to think of spiritual matters as being very abstract and complicated, and they are to me too. And that's why I've made a specialty of trying to make it simple and straightforward. There are a zillion things in your life where you go through these 4 stages without even thinking about it. Or if you do think about it, you don't have anxiety about it. You don't fret, you don't obsess, you don't procrastinate, you're not frightened of the process. You simply figure it out. So at first you don't know that something's an issue. Then you become aware something's an issue. You gain some understanding of what is going on, what's causing it, what you're doing, what other people are doing, so that you eliminate the cause, which will, of course, eliminate the effect. And then at that point, there's a knowing. I invite you to remember all the times where you've gone through this little vignette, this little scenario, in a matter of 5 minutes or less. It's a big deal when we do spiritual work only when we're attached to not seeing. And that's part of the destructive quality of the life force, where we want to do something and we don't want to stop. So we don't want awareness and we don't want understanding. So we're pushing against that while we're reaching forward and trying to get what we want. Perhaps you can see in all my hand gestures, there's a lot of self-will in this process. And so for this lecture, for the whole month, I introduced as much as I could of the concepts in Pathwork Lecture 43, which is 3 personality types: reason, will, and emotion. Now, that by itself is a year or two worth of study. And nobody's got that kind of patience or has that level of interest. So I try to throw it in whenever it comes up. I just toss some quotes in or a chart so that you can get a feel for how that would fit in this situation. So constructive and destructive life forces, healthy and unhealthy motives in desire. The elements here that are reason, will, and emotion are that we either try to reason our way out of it, and we go into rationalization rather than actual reason. We try to push through it, creating forcing currents, which is also highlighted in this lecture. We try to push through it with our self-will, or we try to feel good about it. So those would be elements of reason, will, and emotion, Ben's attractions. Even the words are hard. We are not types. We don't try to identify which type you are. These are attitudes and ways of dealing with things. One leans heavily towards a rational, reasonable way of seeing and looking at things and explaining things. Another wants to do and be aggressive and act out in life, which is more self-will. And the other wants to get along and have fun and have a good time, enjoy the pleasures of life. These three tendencies in us will lead us to address things in different ways. So I find the reason, will, and emotion lectures, and there's 20 lectures in the whole syllabus of 258 Pathwork lectures. There's a minimum of 20 that are specifically in that triad. In this lecture, the guide calls them interlocking triads of reason, will, and emotion. So that what you're trying to do is find your tendencies, your favorites. You're also trying to find your blind spots, what you don't want. So it's a big concept, and I try to nibble at it by putting threads of it in the lectures that refer to it. So in this lecture, that's what I've done. So again, if you're trying to work on these materials, what stands in your way is your style, which may be overwhelmingly have an agenda of its own, or another one of the triads in the reason, will, and emotion. I don't know what word to use. Cadre charts is Pathwork Lecture 30, which is pride, self-will, and fear. And that gets in your way too. Now, I try to come up with practical examples, and this is the best I could do this week. I walk my family's dog twice a week to help them out because they're working. And when I take the dog out for the walk, it's a good 2-hour walk. We have a long walk. We go to the dog park off leash and come back. So she gets a really good outing. But before she goes, she likes to sit on the stoop. So we open the door and she goes out on the stoop and sits. And what she's saying is, I would like you to sit here for a while outside in the fresh air. So I sit down with her and read my book or look at my phone. Inevitably, while we're sitting in this 15 or 20 minutes, when a dog walks by, she will get very agitated and run down the stairs and start barking at the dog. Now, she's not a hostile or aggressive dog. So I find it slightly amusing that since she knows she's behind a small gated area, she can be so brave. I find it a little hypocritical, to use a human term for this. And it irritates me and exasperates me because, of course, as she bolts down the stairs and barks, the other owner and dog get a little agitated, and so that's the setup. I didn't know how to handle it. I don't know how to handle it. She's working on intuition. She's working on dog stuff that I don't share. And the aha I got this week is that the dog may need to be able to be hostile for a few moments a week. That she doesn't do that normally. She's normally a little careful about other dogs. She may need these few moments to vent her spleen, to vent these feelings about other dogs, and she does it in a safe place. However, from my perspective, she's making the neighbors uncomfortable, and so there's a little pride in me that's affected by this. There's self-will that I don't want her to do that, and naturally fear that the other person will be upset. So in this one tiny example, I see it as a destructive force. but I'm not sure the dog sees it as a destructive force. And I'm not sure it is a destructive force. It may be very constructive for her to have these venting sessions. And yet, as the so-called master, the person in charge with the leash, I haven't been able to just relax and accept, let dogs be dogs. Now, I know that may sound far afield, but I like to put things far afield because then they're removed from your domestic situation or your employment situation or your friend situation, which is volatile and painful and hot and urgent. I'm inviting you to see in other areas of life where you decide something is bad and you fight against it. And the reason you can't calm down or just say yes is there's an investment there. There's some kind of agenda going on in you. And that's what I find in spiritual work, is when we're holding on to false beliefs or destructive tendencies. Inside that is pride, self-will, and fear, or a false belief that we're trying to protect that we do not wish to give up yet. So the last thing I'd like to leave you with is that this work is always done at your own pace, in your own time. There is no deadline. So the last thing that came up in the couple meetings we've had this week is people wondering, is this right or wrong? I think that that's asking for a judgment on our behavior instead of allowing it to be explored. Once you judge something as bad, you don't really want to explore it. And if you judge something as good, you let it go. So my invitation would be, instead of judging what you're doing as bad or good, I take the word constructive and destructive, and instead I use the word deconstructive. So like a house, you can construct a house or you can destruct a house, but you can also deconstruct a house so that you can walk it back a bit, take apart the parts that aren't working, and then build it back up again. So I try to get away from words that are inherently negative or pejorative or bring up the specter of bad versus good, because it doesn't help this work. So that if you're just saying, how could I make my life better? What needs to be helped? What should I be working on? What do I want to work on? And then you look at it and you say the equivalent of, what are the elements here? What's going on? So that's a short summary outlining a bit of Pathwork Lecture 56, which is healthy and unhealthy desires, healthy and unhealthy motives in desires. I get that wrong all the time. I hope you read the lecture, and thanks for listening.